We good? All right, welcome to week 1 in our spring trimester, our class on Hosea. And let me make sure my mic is actually on. It is. So again, going through the syllabus, this left-hand side column, that's what I'll be doing each week. The right-hand side, that is your job each week, is to read those chapters prior to coming to class. And we spoke briefly about the timeline here. Hosea is a contemporary of Micah, Isaiah, Amos, and his prophecies started in the time of Jeroboam. And he mentions Jeroboam in here a couple of times. He also mentions the other kings after Jeroboam in here, which is how we know it went past the time of Jeroboam. And so we'll see that. And again, he's considered a pre-exilic prophet, which means what? What time frame are we looking at when we talk pre-exilic? You know, he's before
the Babylonian exile.
Yeah, the Babylonian exile, right? So he actually was present during the time of the Assyrian exile because he lived past Hezekiah's time, and all of that occurrence happened during this time frame as well. So Hosea was around for quite a while. But we're going to see a lot of similarities here between Hosea and Amos. But Hosea comes at it from a different angle. And we're going to see how the Lord uses Hosea and what he does to Hosea, because I'm thinking, man, to be a prophet of God was not all, rose beds. It was a hard life. And you look at, for instance, the life of Jeremiah. Now, Amos seemed to have it pretty good. It didn't seem like he got sort of made fun of, and they sort of shunned him. Oh, Amos, leave this place. We don't need your prophesying and stuff like that. But there was no physical torture of Amos that we know of. But with Hosea, what the Lord puts him through is something else. Definitely different than what we're used to seeing with the prophets. And so what happens is and as we start out, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but what happens is many theologians look at this and say, well, God would never do that to a prophet. He would never make a prophet marry a prostitute. Therefore, these things must be symbolic. They must be allegorical. There must be other deeper meanings to these things. And so we're going to talk about that tonight, and what the possible meanings of Hosea's marriage could be, and then what we hold to there. Okay, so we're going to look at and introduce the book tonight, and those are the sections we'll look at. And again, when you guys get the booklets, I'd encourage you to read up on that, read through it. But I'll be talking about this a lot tonight, so it should look familiar to you when you read through it. So let's start from the beginning here. The title of the book is named, obviously, for the author of the book, Hosea, and who's also the principal character of this book, because the Lord is using him to demonstrate Israel's unfaithfulness to the Lord. And so a lot of the book revolves around Hosea himself. So let's look at Hosea. We'll talk about the author here briefly. Hosea, the word itself in the Hebrew means salvation. Okay, I always find it kind of interesting how the prophets' names have these meanings that relate directly to the Lord and his work with the people of Israel, and Hosea's is no exception here. So all that's known about the prophet is that Hosea records is what Hosea records about himself in the first few chapters of this book. Hosea does include Judah, as I mentioned before, in some of his prophecies. In fact, one of them, just a real simple mention, if you're in Hosea chapter 1, look at verse 7, because he's talking about the nation of Israel prior to that. And then in verse 7, Hosea, speaking for the Lord, says, "But I will have compassion on the house of Judah and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by the bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen." So what deliverances, I know we haven't gotten into chapter 1 yet, but just off the top of your head, what deliverance is Hosea speaking of there in verse 7 of chapter 1?
Maybe when they escaped Egypt and the horsemen.
Well, I think it's later than that. I think he's talking about, once again, just like Amos, the coming judgment of Israel. And then he says, but with Judah, I'll have compassion on the house of Judah. Well, when did he have compassion on them?
Oh, are we talking about Sennacherib?
Yeah. So Assyria overwhelms the northern kingdom. And even though, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but there's going to be kings that follow Jeroboam and stuff, but those kings are appointed by the Assyrians themselves. They're really puppet kings. They're not real kings. And but with Israel, and we're all familiar with the story, they move on down there to Judah, and the Lord delivers Judah. And as he mentions here in verse 7, he will deliver them by the Lord and not by the bow, sword, battle, horse, or horseman. So in other words, they didn't even have to fight for their deliverance. And of course, we're all familiar with that story. So anyway, there's a couple of places in here where Hosea mentions Judah, and that's one of them. But the main thrust of his activity and the things that he says was directed toward Israel, and we'll be looking at a whole bunch of those. It's possible that Hosea was from the northern kingdom. He refers to the king of the northern kingdom as our king. When you go to chapter 7 really quick. This is just a clue to where Hosea is from, because we don't know really much about him. But in verse 5, says, "On that day of our king, the princes become sick with the heat of wine." Okay, so he speaks of the king of Israel being our king. So that's kind of a clue that possibly he is from the northern kingdom. Apart from the name of Hosea's father, which we see in chapter 1, verse 1, nothing's known about Hosea's ancestry. So if you look at chapter 1, verse 1, you see the whole ancestry that's revealed to us in Scripture, which is the word of the Lord, which came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, or Beeri, I think it's Beeri, during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. Okay, so you see the name of his father, Beeri, and nothing else is known about Beeri, okay, except that he is the father of Hosea. His wife's father is named. In verse 3 of chapter 1, if you look at that, says he went and took Gomer, the daughter, okay, this is a warning, don't ever marry a woman named Gomer, okay. He went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, okay, so Diblaim was the father of his wife, okay, so you have those small amounts of genealogy there related to Hosea and his wife Gomer. But his occupation, his death, his birth, none of those things are recorded here or elsewhere in Scripture. So So what we just read really is as much as we know about Hosea's history. Okay, let's look at the date of the writing. So we saw the timeline up there earlier, but Hosea 1:1 really gives us a general chronological framework in which Hosea prophesied. He lists 4 kings of Judah and 1 king of Israel, and I have them up on the board here because there's a little bit of a history with them. He only lists Jeroboam. He doesn't list these kings down here, so we'll talk about them here in a second. So in Israel, he lists Jeroboam II, but the fact that he also lists from Judah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah after Uzziah. Remember, in Amos's time, it was just Uzziah. That was the only king of Judah mentioned. But here he mentions these kings that follow Uzziah, namely Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So if he mentions those kings who followed Uzziah, why didn't he mention the kings that followed after Jeroboam? Okay, so and those are the kings I have mentioned up there: Zechariah, Shallum, Menahem, Pekahiah, Pekah, and Hosea. Okay, why didn't he mention them? Because they were also the same time frame as those 3 kings of Judah. So it's possible that it's because only Jeroboam, out of all of these kings that you see on the slide there, only Jeroboam was mentioned because he was the last king of Israel by divine appointment. Okay, he was the last king that was essentially ordained by God for the nation, and he reigned a fairly significant amount of time. So God has promised Jehu that his descendants would sit on the throne of Israel 4 more generations, and this included Jehoahaz, Jehoash, Jeroboam. But the interesting thing is that 4th generation is Zechariah. Now, so you'd think, okay, well, shouldn't Zechariah also be one of those God-ordained kings that should be listed here? And the author thinks that potentially he should have been. However, he only reigned for 6 months before he was assassinated. So they think he was insignificant enough. He really didn't do anything except that it's recorded of him in 2 Kings that he was an evil king. And I'm going to read that to you right now. In 2 Kings chapter 15, verses 8 through 10, this is the whole history of Zechariah, his 6-month reign. It says this: in the 38th year of Azariah, the king of Judah, Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel in Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom, for 6 months. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord as his fathers had done. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. Then Shallum, the son of Jabesh, okay, the next king here, conspired against him and struck him before the people and killed him and reigned in his place. Okay, that's the whole history of Zechariah there in his 6-month reign. Okay, but he was extremely evil, and then Shallum comes along and assassinates him and takes over the kingship from him at that point. Okay, and Zechariah was, but Shallum was not in the line in which the Lord had ordained in Scripture. So that's probably the best answer there is as far as why more kings weren't mentioned after Jeroboam II. Is the only one that was ordained by God after that was Zechariah, and he reigned a very short time, and he was assassinated by one of the puppet rulers. So when you look at Shallum, Menahem, Pekahiah, Pekah, and Hosea, none of these were legitimate kings on the throne of Israel. There's actually mention of it, which I thought was kind of interesting. Look in chapter 8 of verse 4, if you want to turn over there really quick. I'm going to start in verse 2 of chapter 8. It says, "They cry out to me, my God, we of Israel know thee. Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him." And then this is the verse here. "They have set up kings, but not by me. They have appointed princes, but I did not know it." Okay? So, in other words, the Lord is chastising them for these kings and princes that were not appointed by him. Okay? That's everybody after Zechariah. Okay? And from this point on, Hosea is the last king of Israel before the nation is totally destroyed. All right, let's see here. All right, so Hosea probably prophesied for about 30 or 40 years, and it's estimated that it was somewhere between, okay, here's a quiz, going back to last class, when was Amos written, approximately? We had a date pretty well nailed down, or at least a year. Close, yeah, 762. Is that Nancy? Good. 762 was the date that we had determined, and that was based on certain natural events that occurred that were actually recorded in history and recorded in the book of Amos. Well, here, Hosea, it's estimated that he prophesied 30 or 40 years, and they estimate that it was between 760, so just a couple years after Amos, all the way to 722 BC. Okay, his contemporaries were, of course, Amos, Micah, Isaiah. He began during the latter part of the reign of Israel's greatest king, which is Jeroboam II. Now, when we say greatest, we're not talking about as far as a good king, because he wasn't. He was known as an evil king in the sight of the Lord, but greatest in terms of prosperity for the northern kingdom. And of course, he continued until Israel fell into the Assyrian hands. So let's look at the purpose of the book of Hosea. Hosea's purpose in writing was to reveal to Israel that her judgment resulted from her unfaithfulness to God. I mean, it's pretty amazing how TBI was set up. When you look at the curriculum that has been laid out for TBI, these classes go together so well, because everything we're talking about here and that we're going to learn in Hosea is everything that Tom's been talking about tonight with regards to unfaithfulness and idolatry and all of those things. Those are exactly the crimes that the northern kingdom was accused of. And God makes or gives them a stark example of that. So the illustration in the book is that God is this faithful husband who has lavished all his favor on his beloved, okay, his beloved being Israel. But Israel was the faithless wife who had abandoned her husband to pursue her lovers. Thus, she deserved to be judged. Okay, in the Old Testament, well, let's look at the church. The church, what is the church's relation to Christ? What's it
called the bride?
Yeah, we are called the bride of Christ, okay? In the Old Testament, the nation of Israel, including Judah, was called what in their relation to God? The wife of God, okay? They are the wife, but we are the bride of Christ. And it's kind of an interesting analogy, but the analogy used here is the same analogy used in the New Testament with respect to the church. You know, those who are faithful to the bridegroom or those who are faithful to their husband. And the Lord uses this because there's such a parallel, as Tom was explaining, between our faithfulness to God and our sexual faithfulness. Where are we sexually? That tells us a lot about our relationship with God. And I think those are things that we need to always be aware of in our life. Where are we at? Okay? And when things come up in our life that tempt us away from the things of God, they usually lead to a sexual immorality. And that's a sign, sexual immorality is a sign of one's abandoning their Lord. Okay? Hopefully not on a permanent basis, but one being unfaithful to God is oftentimes characterized by one who is unfaithful in their marriage. Okay? Sexual impurity and purity in worship to God carry a huge parallel in life, okay? And we should always remember that. So speaking of Israel, the faithless wife, in Hosea, because she was that faithless wife, she deserved to be judged. Yet even in the midst of judgment, God would not totally abandon his people. Okay, and Tom's been doing a great job talking about this issue of the horns of the dilemma. It's exactly what we saw in Amos, and it's what we're seeing here. Despite the unfaithfulness of Israel, he would not abandon his people. And just like in Amos, we're going to see in this book as well, there's a section that's specifically dedicated to the restoration of the nation and the hope that they have. And it's illustrated through Hosea and his relationship with his wife, which is a very interesting story and analogy. So the theme of the book is called God's love for his rebellious wife. Okay, so I'm just going to read over this argument really quick, and then we're going to look at the issue of the wife and his unchaste wife and what it means. So the first 3 chapters of Hosea's prophecy depict a tragic object lesson in which Hosea marries an unfaithful wife who, after their first child, had children through her affairs with other men. This was used to depict God's relationship to Israel, which had proven to be unfaithful to him. So this object lesson was later abandoned by Hosea in favor of this direct prophecy of judgment against the nation. And we're going to see that in chapters 4 through 13. Okay, so Hosea begins this, and it's termed in very legal language. Okay, so he's beginning what's called here a lawsuit against the people of Israel by indicting them for 3 crimes. The first one is they lacked faithfulness. The second crime was they had no loyalty or love. And the third crime was that they had no knowledge of God. And we're going to see those crimes laid out in chapter 4 and then expanded on in the rest of the chapters. What's interesting is the order which I gave them to you, it's actually presented in the rest of the chapters in reverse order. And I'm not sure why that is, but it's kind of interesting that it's given to us in one order in chapter 4 and then expanded upon exactly the opposite in the rest of the chapters. Let's see. And then you have the lawsuits and the charges in chapters 6 through 13. And then the final section of the book indicates that even in the midst of this judgment, in chapter 14, that God will not abandon his people. Okay, let's look at here this issue of Hosea's marriage. There's a lot of discussion amongst it and a lot of disagreement amongst it, amongst theologians. So I actually have it's actually a website, a Bible website, and it gives there's all sorts of commentary references that you can access for any book of the Bible. And when you look at them, it's amazing the divergence of opinions you get from these things. But they do disagree on this. And that's just a basic warning too. Don't just pick up any commentary out there and read it and think, oh, well, that must be what it means. We have trusted commentaries that we go by, trusted theologians that we will use when we go to reference a verse or something like that if we need to find out information. So
Larry, is there really any reason for us to not read this as literal?
Well, that's about what we're about to. That's about what we're about. That's what we're about to talk about. Okay, so you're getting way ahead of me.
Sorry.
Well, about a minute ahead of me. But yeah, so there are 4 different views, as you can see on the monitor there, that speak of Hosea's marriage. But first, let's go back to chapter 1 really quick, and let's read verses 2 and 3. It says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go, take to yourself a wife of harlotry, and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. So he, Hosea, went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Okay, so you have this issue of the Lord commanding Hosea to take this wife of harlotry, he calls her. So what is this? What does it mean? And there are 4 possibilities that I have up here on the screen. And the first one is purely allegorical, and it's what's called the hypothetical marriage view. Did the Lord really command him to literally marry this woman who would be a harlot? And or is it an allegory? Is it symbolic of something else? Well, obviously there's a parallel between the woman and Israel, right? But the view itself sees this marriage between Hosea and Gomer as never happening historically, but understands it either as a vision or an allegory symbolic of the relationship of God to unfaithful Israel. So this view, by the way, was held by many Jews and continues to be popular well into the 19th century. Okay, there's also contemporary theologians who still hold to this view today. One gentleman named E.J. Young was one of them. But those who hold it say that God would not ever have commanded a prophet to marry an unchaste woman, especially since the priests had been expressly forbidden to do so. Okay, and so if you want a reference to that, Leviticus chapter 21, verse 7 and verse 14, expressly forbid the priesthood to be with an unchaste woman. They also point out the significance of an act as described in the book is regularly given immediately after the description, which is a pattern in symbolic literature. So they're coming up with, they say, well, in allegorical literature, this is what you do, and this is how it's presented. And so they say, well, that's what is happening here in Isaiah. But there are some problems with this whole thing. First of all, Hosea is very straightforward in his narrative, and he gives very little indication of any symbolism being intended in the whole narrative. Some of the things of central importance, for instance, the name of his wife, are not presented symbolically at all. Furthermore, the narrative includes numerous details uncalled for. Okay, let me see. Numerous details uncalled for. Where the intent? Oh, okay. The grammar here is not real good. So some of the other examples, Gomer's called the daughter of Diblaim. Okay, the third child, Lo-Ammi, is said to have been born only after the second child was weaned. So in other words, it's going into a lot of detail on the people and on the children. And it says, such details belong to history, not allegory. And finally, it's difficult to understand why an allegory would be spread over 2 chapters, separated by the longest chapter in the book. In other words, chapter 1 and chapter 3 speak of this allegory, and then chapter 2, which is the longest chapter in the book, separates those two, and that doesn't make sense from that perspective. So the second viewpoint is that, okay, this was a literal marriage, but Gomer here is unchaste. So in other words, this view holds that the marriage did occur and that Gomer was already an unchaste person, possibly a temple prostitute. Arguments in favor of this view are mainly 3. Number 1, that this is kind of the most natural meaning of God's command to Hosea, go and take for yourself an adulterous wife. Okay. The second thing is that the word of command take most likely goes with children of unfaithfulness as well as the adulterous wife. So in other words, the Lord is telling Hosea in this view, go and take this wife and take these children of adultery that she had. Take them for yourself. Okay? So, in other words, Gomer must already have been a prostitute at this time in order to have had these children. So she was already unchaste. And then it goes on. I won't get into all the detail. There's more reasons for it, but there's reasons to question this viewpoint as well. It's questionable whether this view does take the command in its most natural meaning. So in other words, they say, go take for yourself an adulterous wife. That's the natural meaning of that, is you're taking for yourself one who is already a harlot or already an adulterer. But they're saying, no, that's not necessarily the most natural meaning. And then it goes into a lot of technical detail on why that is not the case from a linguistic standpoint. And I don't want to get into all the details, mostly because of time here. But it says, if the first means a woman who already practiced prostitution, then the second would mean children who did the same. In other words, that the children practiced prostitution. In other words, so they're getting into the grammatical construction of the sentence and saying, that's not really the natural meaning of the sentence. Okay? So they said a more likely meaning is that an adulterous wife, in other words, this adulterous wife that he was to take, signifies a woman of an adulterous character, but not necessarily having practiced adultery yet, because she was not married. And the children being born to have similar characters, and that would be supported by the more natural construction of the language. Okay? That was kind of technical, kind of long. When you guys read it, hopefully that makes a lot more sense to you. So that's the second view, is that it is a literal marriage, but that she was already unchaste at the time of the marriage. The third view is what's called spiritual infidelity, and this view is not held by many. It's held much less widely than the other views, but this is one in which the situation is one of a spiritual nature rather than a physical infidelity. So Gomer became unchaste because, like the Israelites of Hosea, she became a worshiper of false gods. Okay, so in other words, they're saying she wasn't an adulterer physically, how we would think of it, but an adulterer because of her idolatry. Okay? And then it goes into arguments explaining how Scripture often uses harlotry as a figure for spiritual unfaithfulness, which is true. Okay? However, we have always adhered to the most literal meaning, and I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. Why would we not do it in this case? And I agree with you totally. There's no reason to not adhere to the most literal meaning, which is that it was a literal marriage by Gomer and Hosea. But in this case, Gomer was chaste in this marriage. And so the marriage did indeed occur, and they were married only for her to become adulterous later. And this is the preferred interpretation. The words an adulterous wife are to be understood proleptically, which means just what we had explained earlier, that she had the propensity to be adulterous. She was a very kind of flirty type of person prior to him marrying her. Okay, so this is a nice kind of warning for young men who might study this book. I heard it said before marriage, have your eyes wide open. Your eyes should be wide open before you're married. Understand who it is you're getting involved with and who you want to potentially marry or date or whatever. And then it said, but after you get married, your eyes should be half shut, okay? Because, we need to be much more gracious toward one another or forgiving. Anyway, and then there's a lot of explanation on the reasons that this is the preferred view, and this is the view that we will take here, okay? That he is marrying Gomer, and that Gomer was chaste at the time of marriage. All right, and then we'll just close on this. The events recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 26 to 32, okay, are the events of the kings in Hosea's time. So if you want to get a good historical background of what's going on at that time of Hosea, you can read those 7 chapters and you should get a good feel for all of those things. It talks about Jeroboam here a little bit, and the fact that his kingdom flourished. There was very little Assyrian influence at the time. Tiglath-Pileser decided to expand toward the west from 733 to 732, and that is when he came into Israel. And from that point on, Israel was at best a puppet state until they eventually, in 722, wiped them out. Okay, so they were a puppet state for about 10 or 12 years there. Okay, and then the last thing we'll look at is, you guys don't have that chart on here, do you? Okay, the last thing we'll look at here is this particular chart is kind of a chart. It's kind of an outline of the book. You see judgment in chapter 1, verses 2 through 9, and then salvation. And then judgment in chapter 2, and salvation after that. Judgment in chapters 4 and 5, salvation, etc. And it goes back and forth like that. And again, the horns of the dilemma really come into play here as it goes back and forth the whole book until it finally culminates in the hope for Israel in the very last chapter of the book, not giving away the specifics like Isaiah does, but certainly the promise of it. Okay, that's all I got. Any questions, comments?